Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're going to be going over buying iPhones off the used market. Link to my most recent iPhone buying guide, specifically on iPhones Apple is selling new. You can find that in the description. We're going to be taking this video step by step, iPhone by iPhone. As always, timestamps in the description below if you want to skip ahead. Perhaps there's an iPhone you're specifically looking at. And in the description will also be links to my specific reviews for any of these phones that I've covered. We're going to be looking at eBay.com to discuss general price points. So this will be US dollars. There's always issues with keeping it US centric, but generally speaking, the relative price differences do tend to stay the same. And so from the $800 used iPhone options to the $50 ones, we're gonna go through all of them. And also, before we quite get started, there is Apple's own refurbished section where they're selling somewhere in between used and new phones that generally have been returned or had issues, and they've fixed up, replaced the display and the battery, and are now selling again on their website. Buying these types of phones are honestly like buying brand new, and you get to save a bit of money while doing it. You'll also often see phones there that Apple doesn't sell otherwise, such as possibly the iPhone 11. The inventory does cycle through very regularly though. I've seen an iPhone 11 for $430, which was a really good deal. That's the same price as the iPhone SE, and I find it difficult to complain about their 11 and 12 Pro prices, so that is something to look at if you're interested. And getting into the used phones, there's a few things you're going to want to make sure you watch out for. The first is make sure whichever phone you end up buying doesn't have an account currently signed in. Often this will be phrased as iCloud locked or Find My iPhone on. If an account is signed in, your phone is basically just going to be a brick because you need to sign out for somebody new to use the phone, and there's a good chance that phone could have been stolen. Definitely the biggest thing to watch out for, especially if a deal seems too good to be true, because, well, it probably is. Always make sure you go for a seller with a strong reputation. You should also watch out for the battery health. If it's at or under 80%, it's likely going to need serviced, or in other words, replaced, which will cost at least, I think, $70 from Apple. And last tip, make sure you're buying a phone that will work with your carrier. So definitely watch out for that. Let's go ahead and start with the best of the used devices, and also the most expensive, the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now it makes sense these are the most expensive used phones you'd be looking at because they only came out a year ago, and yet Apple doesn't sell them. This is because, frankly, the 14 Pro isn't much different. Now very recently I did an in-depth 13 Pro review that I recommend checking out if you're interested, but on that I basically said this phone is probably worth buying, at least over the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, and if you're okay with potentially needing to buy used, even over the 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max. That's because these phones are surprisingly good value over on eBay, while having all the features that you would expect from a Pro phone. We're talking 3 cameras, 120Hz refresh rate, extremely fast chipset, the exact same in the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. The battery life is amazing. There's a lot to like here, and I saw the iPhone 13 Pro for as low as like $600, which is absurd, and you probably won't find one for that price, but I was seeing consistently around $700 without too much issue for the 128 gig model, and that is an insanely good deal. So the 13 Pro, absolutely worth buying. Highly recommend it. Amazing display, amazing cameras, amazing everything, all for a price much cheaper than the 14 Pro, a phone that's really not that much better. 100% if you've got the money, the 13 Pro is probably one of the best bang for your buck phones out there, just in general. And so now we move to the iPhone 13 used. Now Apple themselves sells the iPhone 13, but it is a bit cheaper used. Apple also sells the 13 mini, they don't sell the 12 mini anymore. Don't buy the 13 mini just because it's cheaper. The iPhone 13 is a very good phone and very close to the iPhone 14. I would recommend buying it new if you want it. Going used, probably looking at around $500 for the regular size. I was seeing 13 minis for $400, but more often over $500. I'm gonna recommend buying this one brand new, the 13 mini, especially if you really want a small phone. The 13 is a basic non-pro phone. It's got 2 camera lenses. The display is good, but it doesn't have 120Hz. Battery life, very good, still very fast. Great phone, probably don't buy it used. So now we come to the 2020 iPhone 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. Apple sells this one refurbished pretty regularly, but if we want to look at eBay, I was seeing $500, which is a pretty intriguing offer for a phone that looks very similar to the new ones. It's got the 3 cameras on the back, it's still extraordinarily fast, the battery life is solid, and the design is practically the exact same. What it's lacking though is Pro Motion, or that 120Hz refresh rate. I got this footage a while ago, but it's a good example of my iPhone 13 Pro versus my iPhone 12. 120Hz versus 60Hz, and so basically it doubles the refresh rate, which makes everything look smoother to the eye. It's a lot nicer feeling, but it also, practically speaking, doesn't really give a lot of benefits besides looking nicer. And if you're really into gaming, it's also good for that, but otherwise it's not something anyone needs. It's just something people tend to want. If that's something you think you can live without or don't really care about, then you don't need to look at the iPhone 13 Pro or the 14 Pro, which definitely makes it a little easier to find a good deal. And the iPhone 12 Pro, again, around $500, not that uncommon. The 12 Pro Max, you can add at least $100 to that. I was even seeing like $700 for the Max, which seems like a lot, especially with the 13 Pro being decently better thanks to the higher refresh rate. So around $500, 12 Pro, good option, but I do recommend trying to find an iPhone 13 Pro. It's probably maybe $100 more, $150 more, but frankly, the 12 Pro is still a great phone. Then there's the iPhone 12. Now, Apple does sell the iPhone 12, but it's not a phone I actually recommend buying from Apple because the 13 is pretty much the same, but better in like every aspect, and it's only $100 more. It also has double the storage, 64 to 128 gigabytes, again, $100 more. But you do also have the 12 mini, which Apple isn't selling. So if we look at eBay here, the iPhone 12 itself seems to be going around $450, $400. But looking around, I was finding better deals. I was even seeing $350, which is really good. It's a very solid smartphone. It has 5G capabilities. The battery life is pretty solid. The speeds are amazing. The cameras are great. You do just have two of them, the ultra wide and wide, but even so, it's a very good camera. Now the iPhone 12 mini I was seeing as low as $300, but often a little bit more than that, closer to $350. The 12 mini is a decent option to consider if you want a small phone and aren't somebody who uses your phone an excessive amount. And I say that because the iPhone 12 mini has an okay battery life. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible either. It should last most people the day, but if you use your phone a lot, the 12 mini probably isn't for you. So if you're a small phone connoisseur, definitely go for the 13 mini. But if you just want a small phone, you don't really care about the newest features, and you don't really do too much except texting and web browsing maybe, then the 12 mini used at around $300, definitely a solid option, and I would buy it every time over something like the iPhone SE. Speaking of the iPhone SE, I suppose we should talk about it. It's the lowest tier device Apple currently sells for $430, which is kind of a lot for what it provides. So there's 3 generations of SE. Of course, the first generation is quite old at this point and irrelevant because it doesn't run iOS 16, but the third and second generations look identical, so you do need to be careful and make sure you buy the right one if you're looking at the used market. The second gen is actually quite interesting, so we'll get to it in a sec, but the third gen. Now, the third gen has a faster chipset than the SE2. It came out in 2022, and it also has 5G networking. Other than that, the phones are practically identical. While I wouldn't buy the third gen SE from Apple, buying used is actually not that bad on eBay. I was often seeing it for around $250, which is really good and a lot better than what Apple is selling it for. Now, the phone itself has a lot to be desired, but it's still very good. It's very, very fast for one thing, and the biggest selling point of it is that it's the final iPhone to have the home button. So this is a good phone for somebody who's not quite ready to move on. The camera's good-ish. It's not great. It's the iPhone 8 sensor, but the photos are quite a bit improved thanks to the newer speeds and everything. The software is able to work harder. Overall, $250 for the third gen SE is not a bad deal. It's definitely a better choice to buy it used, I think, than to buy it brand new, just because Apple does charge so much for it. Then there's the iPhone SE2, aka the iPhone SE 2020. This phone goes for crazy cheap. It actually could be one of the best deal iPhones out there. It's not much different from the SE3. The battery life is a bit worse, and it's got an older chipset, but the camera itself is practically the same, and everything else is the same. It looks the same. I was even seeing like cracked models under $100, which I don't recommend buying, but even so, it goes to show what a good deal this can be. This phone runs iOS 16 no problem, and it's going to run the newest version for years onwards. If you're concerned about battery life, it's not a good phone to buy, but otherwise, the iPhone SE2 might just be the best value iPhone you can buy that runs iOS 16. And it's definitely not something I expected to say coming into this, but turns out it's a really, really good deal. Let's look at the iPhone 11, a phone I've been recommending for years now, but Apple is no longer selling. We also have to talk about the 11 Pro, and we'll get to it in a sec. But the iPhone 11 I want to mention because if you're not buying an iPhone SE 2 or 3, probably the next step up to go to an iPhone 11. It's got the same speeds as the SE2, but the screen is larger, the camera is much better, and it's just overall a better phone. And for the 11, you're seeing about $300, often a bit under, and that's straight up just a good deal. It's a great phone. It's got good battery life. Be careful because they're very common, and so you want to make sure you're getting a good one. Don't buy one without Face ID or bad battery life, anything like that. But generally speaking, iPhone 11 is going to be a very good value iPhone to buy, and it gets you that newer design, which I know a lot of people are going to want. That's also a good big size too. Then you've got the iPhone 11 Pro. This phone is one of my personal favorites, and I'm happy to say it is a pretty good deal. Apple sells this one also, like the 12 Pro, fairly consistently refurbished, but if we go over to eBay, the 11 Pro seems to be going for around $400. I would buy this over the iPhone 12 Pro myself just because the phones are not that different. If you're getting an 11 Pro for $400 or even less, I was seeing under at some points, and the 11 Pro Max seems to be closer to $500. I would definitely recommend the 11 Pro. It's a really good phone still. It was the first one to have night mode, the 3 cameras. There's a lot to like, and you're not missing out on a lot of the new features, so I highly recommend the iPhone 11 Pro. I think it's one of the better deals for the price point. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of these now. What we really have next is the iPhone XS, XR, and the iPhone 10, and the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. Can't forget about those. So let's talk about them, starting with the XS and XS Max. Apple has not sold these phones since 2019, and so they're going for fairly cheap for what are pretty solid phones. We're talking about $250, sometimes lower, closer to $200, similar prices to the iPhone 11, and the big difference between the two is of course the XS has a much nicer display, but it's also worse in the camera department. For an actually good condition iPhone XS, it looked closer to $250, XS Max more like $300. It really depends, gotta look around for a deal, and do be careful when buying a phone that's this old. It's from 2018, it's 4 years old, so there's a good chance the battery could be in pretty rough shape, and the battery was never very good on these phones to begin with. The XS Max of course is better for battery life because it's bigger, but it's also not very good. Now these phones are still quite fast, the camera's okay. It's not bad, mind you, just compared to what we have now. Like, there's no night mode. The display is gorgeous, don't get me wrong there, and overall it's still a very solid phone, just not one I'd particularly look to buy at this point, at least usually. If you find a phone for $200 and it's in genuinely great condition, not a bad deal, definitely worth considering, even compared to its close sibling, the iPhone XR. Now the XR came out at the same time as the XS, and it was the first of the Pro versus non-Pro phones, the more budget option. Apple hasn't sold this since, I guess, late 2021, and price-wise I was seeing $200, $250, and that's for the 64GB model. I'd say for good condition, slightly cheaper than the XS, and the XR has a lot going for it. It's just as fast as the iPhone XS. The camera is the same main sensor as the XS. It doesn't have the telephoto, but it can still do portrait shots. The XR is still a very solid phone. My brother was using it all the way up to about a month back when he upgraded to the 13 Pro, and he honestly didn't even really feel like he needed to upgrade, but after using the 13 Pro for a bit, he did decide it was worth it for him. And that's the thing, right? The XR is still very fast, and it can do pretty much anything you would want it to. So at $200, it's not a bad deal. Probably look to an iPhone 11 though, just because it does have a better camera, and it's not that much more money. Now we come to the iPhone 10. Now this came out 2017, and it's of the oldest iPhones still supported on iOS 16, which is hard to believe. The iPhone 10 isn't much cheaper than the XS from what I've seen. It was only sold for a year as well, so I was also seeing it around $200. The XS was closer to $250 on average. The 10 is more like $200. If you get a good condition model for that, it's not bad. The biggest thing about it is battery life. Battery life on these phones was never fantastic, and it is 5 years old now, so even if it's in great battery health, I wouldn't expect a lot from that. And overall, because it is so close in price to the iPhone XS, I'd say you should upgrade to that one, or look at something like the iPhone XR, iPhone 11, 11 Pro, and so on and so forth. It's hard for me to recommend a phone like the iPhone 10 just because it is of the oldest iPhones. It has the A11 chipset, which is still fast, but it's the oldest supported. If you found it for $150, decent deal. Otherwise, I'd avoid. Then there's the iPhone 8 and the 8 Plus. Now these are kind of two different phones in terms of buying them, and they've always kind of been like that since they stopped being sold, just because the 8 Plus is actually quite unique in that it's the last large home button iPhone. This has always tended to inflate its price to at least where the iPhone 10 is, and that still seems to be the case today. Looking at eBay, it's around $200, maybe a little cheaper. I did see like $150. And the 8 Plus, if you really want a large home with a home button, it is objectively the best iPhone you'll be able to buy, but I'm not going to recommend it just because it's the oldest iPhone still supported, like the iPhone 10. I would say probably go up to the iPhone XR. It's still a fairly large phone. The 8 Plus appeals to a very specific niche, but unless you're getting it for a bit under $150, and even if you are, I would probably want to buy something newer myself. And then there's the iPhone 8. Now the 8 Plus always had a half-decent battery. The smaller phone, on the other hand, has a smaller battery, and so it's never been very good for battery life, and that's definitely a concern 5 years later. But it is very cheap. It looks the same as the iPhone SE3 and the SE2, though it has a significantly older chipset. It still performs well though, just like the 10 and the 8 Plus. The camera, there is only the single lens on the back and no portrait mode, but otherwise that and the battery life, it's not too much different from the 8 Plus and the 10. It's not quite as fast technically, it has less RAM, but I don't think there'd be much discernible difference in real life usage. So I was seeing even under $100, which isn't terrible at all. Pretty decent deal for a phone that runs iOS 16. Even if you had to keep it plugged in 24/7, you're still running iOS 16. But the iPhone SE2 was around $150, and it has a chipset from 2019 rather than 2017, so that's a big difference. So I'd definitely rather get that phone personally. It is the cheapest iPhone though, running the current software, and if you wanted to go further, you're going down to iOS 15. The 7 Plus and the 7, the 6S Plus and the 6S, and then the original iPhone SE. Those phones range anywhere up to $100. The 7 Plus maybe a little bit more. I wouldn't buy any of them, but if you are on an extreme budget, something like the iPhone SE or the 6S can be found for under $50, and it runs iOS 15, which can still at this point do pretty much anything. So that's for those on a pretty desperate budget, but otherwise I would avoid them. And so that's about it for this video. To summarize fairly quickly here, at low price brackets at around $150, the SE2 is a surprisingly good deal. The iPhone 11 is also a good deal at around $300, a little lower. The 11 Pro at $300, $400 is not bad whatsoever, and I think the iPhone 13 Pro, especially close to $600, is a very good deal. So those are the main phones I'm recommending, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you're using any of these phones, and hopefully this helped you out. There's not a lot of content out there when it comes to buying used iPhones specifically, so I wanted to do kind of a separate video for it, and yeah, hope you enjoyed. So if you did, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content similar to this. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.